I got this book box from my local Goodwill for $4 and I'm building an abandoned miniature lab inside it. I'm going to get started by making this book look like leather, but first I'm covering up the printed pages on the side because that's the only detail I'm keeping. I sanded the super smooth paper on the outside of the book, and now I'm gluing rope along the spine to simulate the raised ridges you see on old leather books. I had to Google it to figure out what these are, but they're apparently visible cords from binding the pages of a book. Using hot glue and jute rope, I added 4 raised bands. I covered the book with tacky glue and now I'm applying brown paper. Before applying the paper, I crinkled it in a small ball to add extra wrinkles and texture. The original book box was really smooth and lacked detail, but the brown paper adds texture and cracks to make it look like leather. I think tacky glue is probably the perfect glue for this because the paper immediately sticks and the moisture from the tacky glue softens it so I can form it around the details. I used the same technique in my Steampunk Diorama on a Dollar Tree tabletop and a plastic briefcase, so this technique works in a smaller scale as well. Keep in mind this box is less than 2.5 inches deep. I'm mixing brown and green acrylic paint as a base coat and adding matte Mod Podge to strengthen the paper and protect it. I use a lot of Mod Podge, so I refill this bottle from the dollar store with this large jar from Walmart. I'm applying a thick, even coat to the entire book box, making sure to turn my brush in multiple directions to get the paint in all of the texture. For the second step, I'm brushing some watered down brown paint over the entire book and wiping it away a small section at a time with a dry paper towel. The paint looks terracotta on camera, but it's actually a dark brown color. I'm wiping the paint off in a circular motion so it'll get stuck up against the ridges and texture of the paper and create some depth. Now I'm dry brushing the book with white paint to make it look like old, dry, cracked leather. By dry brushing, I'm accentuating the highest points in the texture. Initially, my plan was to dry brush with just the white, but I thought it looked too stark, so I followed it up by dry brushing some pale brown. I painted the raised bands gold and may add some letters to the outside of the box later, but for now I'm moving on to the inside. I made a previous video I'll link below in the description showing step by step how I created the peeling paint on the walls, the beadboard, and I made a wooden floor. There's lots of great information in that video, so check it out, but I'll give you a rundown of what I did. I painted the walls a combination of white and brown and used a toothbrush to splatter some paint over the surface to make it look like mold. Then I added some liquid latex around the room and manipulated it while it was still wet and also after it had dried. I sponge painted over the dry liquid latex and peeled it some more after the paint dried. Liquid latex is used in special effects makeup and I got mine from Amazon. I made 2 different colors of wash using water and acrylic paint and dripped them on the walls. I used a paper towel to remove the excess color. I used this beadboard from my local dollhouse store and some skinny sticks from Walmart for the floor. I used a combination of paint, some washes, and some more liquid latex to age the beadboard. With the walls and the floor done, I'm moving on to the accessories. I want this miniature room to look like a lab, so I'm making an industrial sink using mat board. Mat board is the thick paper you see in picture frames, and I got a huge sheet of it at Michael's for $7. I drilled a hole in the bottom and used some wax to attach it to a plastic paint cup so I can add some wood glue. When the wood glue dries, it creates a surface that's really smooth and looks a lot like ceramic, enamel, or metal. I first saw Ava from Bentley House Minis use this technique in her abandoned coffee shop project. When the wood glue dries, it dries yellow, so now I'm using some high quality paint from Vallejo to paint it white. I got this bottle from my local hobby store for $3 and it's definitely the best quality paint I have. This paint is really nicely pigmented, but it still took 2 coats to cover the yellow. I put on some rubber gloves, and now I'm using UV resin to make the sink look more like porcelain. I used a combination of a toothpick and my heat gun to flatten the resin. The heat thins out the resin so it lays flatter. I covered 2 sides at a time and cured it with my UV flashlight. I painted some pipes black, and now I'm using super glue and baking soda to add areas of crusty texture. This set of pipes is from a Resin bathroom kit. I painted the baking soda black, and now I'm painting the pipe silver, avoiding all of the textured areas. These pipes were already silver, but they looked really bright and new, and I'm trying to go for the look of galvanized pipes. Now I'm dry brushing some orange over the textured areas to fake the look of rust. You could stop there, but I'm enhancing the look with the Goblin's Hut Dirty Down Rust. It's a product I learned about from Black Magic Craft. Honestly, I'm applying too much here, but it's because I was looking through my camera instead of watching what I was doing. The pipe sticks up through the hole in the sink, and I'm using a grommet as the drain. I'm aging it with a combo of the super glue and baking soda trick and painting it to look rusty. I end up filling the sink with dirty water, mold, and bits of the ceiling, so you don't actually end up seeing this. I'm using these vintage wall faucets, so I drilled some holes and glued them to the wall. I didn't like how the knobs stuck straight forward, so I clipped them off and replaced them with a metal bead that looks like an old-timey handle. I aged them into place with some more super glue, baking soda, paint, and rust effects. I finished with a little silver dry brushing. To make it look like it's been here for years and years, after I glued the pipe and sink to the wall, I added a bit of dripping rust. I got this cabinet for $2 at my local dollhouse store and replaced the missing glass with trash plastic. Before I attach the glass, I'm cutting a triangle out to make it look like it's missing. In the end, when I'm adding all of the debris to the floor, I'll make sure I add either some tiny pieces of cut up plastic or maybe some glitter to look like broken glass. I'm gluing this cabinet in the middle of the wall and adding shelves on either side. I'm using wide popsicle sticks to make the shelves, but just one is too thin, so I'm stacking 2. I'm using a combo of wood glue and hot glue. Even with the 1, 2, 3 blocks, the moisture from the glue was causing the thin wood to warp, so I added a bunch of clips. I measured the gaps on either side of the cabinet and cut the 4 shelves, and I'm using some spackle to fill the crack at the front. I painted the shelves white, and I'm using some chalk pastels to age them. I want the shelves to look really grimy, like they've been sitting here for decades, so I'm using some black and brown chalk pastels. I think this is a cautionary tale against not crafting when you're really tired, because I didn't like how dark the chalk pastel was turning out, so I just kept adding more. I got desperate and started wiping them off with a wet paper towel, and I really love how they end up looking. I'm making a bunch of bottles out of hot glue and resin, so I don't know how much of this you'll end up seeing, but I'm using a push pin and some paint to add some rings on the shelves. I glued 3 of the shelves on normally, but I want to make one look like it collapsed, so I'm using my X-Acto knife to scrape at the cabinet. I want it to look like the shelf was glued there, and when it collapsed, it pulled away some of the paint. I attached each of the shelves with wood glue along the back and on both ends. Now I'm working on the bottles for the shelves. I printed these vintage medical labels from Etsy, and I'm using some matte Mod Podge to seal them. I'm making molds to cast the bottles, and I already have a couple I did previously, and I'm doing a couple more now. I'm using amazing mold putty that I got on Amazon, but there are a few other products that do the same thing. I mixed 2 equal parts of part A and B, but your instructions may differ if you use something else. Once it's thoroughly mixed, I added the bottle I'd like to make a mold of. This mold will set at room temperature in about 15 minutes. This is a really basic mold, but if you'd like more instruction, I linked a video from Bentley House Miniatures in my description. I made a couple other molds, and now I'm filling them with either UV resin or hot glue. The other molds I made are too deep for the UV light to penetrate and cure the resin, so I'm making a resin bottle with this shallow mold. I added some resin and cured it with my UV flashlight. To make the bottle a little more substantial, I added another layer of UV resin and cured it again. I'm wearing rubber gloves as I remove the bottle because the resin isn't completely cured on the underside and the stuff is toxic. I finished curing these bottles after they were unmolded, and I really love how clear they are. My preferred method for making bottles is using hot glue because it sets really quickly, it's non-toxic, and it's very cheap. Using my precision tip glue gun, I'm getting it into all of the small details. This looks clear now, but it does dry with a cloudy appearance, which can be one of the drawbacks of using hot glue if you want it to look see-through. The hot glue also works really well in the deeper molds. The Mod Podge is dry, and now I'm using watercolor to paint over top of the labels. If you look, you can see a pale area around the labels where the Mod Podge is repelling some of the paint. I sealed this before adding the watercolor because I've made the mistake in the past of not sealing it, and it obscured all the print and made it look really blurry and runny. I don't know if it makes a difference since the labels will be glued to bottles, but I also aged the back. Then I used a toothbrush to splatter some watered down black paint to make the labels look moldy and cut them out once they were dry. Cutting them out individually would take forever, so I cut across the bottom, then turned the paper sideways and snipped the sides before cutting them out across the top. As the hot glue got hotter, the bottles became more yellow, so I'm painting them in shades of green and brown so they look like vintage or antique medicine bottles. I glued the bottles to a stick so it's easier to paint them. For some of the clear bottles, I just kept them looking clear and cloudy, or I painted them a really light color so they look like see-through glass. I left this bottle hot glue yellow and glued a lime water label to it because I really think it matches the color. I painted all of the bottle caps black, but I wish I had added some red and silver ones for variety. Overall, I'm really happy with how the bottles turned out, and I even had some leftover labels so I can add some boxes to the shelves. For the boxes, I mostly used small scraps of wood, and I also layered pieces of mat board to make rectangles. Here are some layers of mat board I'm covering with paper scraps left over from the labels. All I did was wrap paper around the rectangle, leaving overhang on each end and gluing them closed like you would wrap a Christmas present. I made some more white boxes using the same paper and different size scraps for variety. The lab will look a lot more interesting and realistic if there are a bunch of different products filling the shelves and cabinet. I'm using a Sharpie and some more scrap paper to make a black box. To introduce another shape, I'm wrapping a small cylinder bead in some paper bag. I cut up a really big label to make it look like a small bottle or something similar. I'm just about ready to start filling the cabinet and the shelves, but I want to use this piece I've been hanging on to for a while. I had a pretty glass bottle that cracked in half, so I added air dry clay to the bottom so I could use it. Using a pipette, I filled the bottle with watered down paint to cover up the white clay inside and make it look used. To cover up the clay base, I'm gluing some yarn around the bottom. I've seen large jugs that had rope or even rattan wrapped around the bottom, so that's what I'm simulating. It looks a bit too bright and cheery for my space, so I'm staining it with some watered down paint. Now I'm using a little bit too much black paint to add some shading. I'm really happy I didn't throw away this glass bottle, and if they ever make a TV show about people who hoard miniatures or trash that they intend to turn into miniatures, I will definitely watch it. I glued the bottles and boxes to the shelves in the cabinet, including some items that look like they slid down the shelf that fell and they're stuck against the wall. I saved 3 bottles to use in the rest of the room. I have a couple broken microscopes and I repaired them with super glue and baking soda. When you sprinkle baking soda over liquid super glue, it dries right away and it's really strong. I'm covering the baking soda with black and silver paint, and I'm using one of these microscopes on the shelf and another on a desk. I'll link the video in the description, but I transformed a Dollar Tree table into an industrial desk, and I'm using some printables from Etsy to accessorize it. I'm adding mat board to the drawers to fill up some of the space so I can use less paper. I'll be adding a few layers of paper, so I'm using some items I accidentally printed out of scale on the bottom since they'll eventually be covered up anyway. I'm adding my favorite pieces to the top where they'll be visible. I made a stack using some mat board and added a couple bottles and a microscope. When you use a microscope, they come with glass slides so you can actually look at something under magnification, so I'm using some trash plastic to cut out some small squares. To make it look like there's actually something on the slides, I'm using a couple different colors of marker. I'm using white glue to attach the slides in front of the microscope like somebody was in the middle of working before this place was abandoned. I'm making a simple metal box to hold some extra slides. I glued the 4 sides to some paper and cut it out once it dried. I'm painting the box silver and adding some rust effects. I added more glass slides to the box and glued it to the desk. For another accessory for the desk, I made a simple mold of 2 test tubes that I 3D printed. I'm filling the mold with UV resin and a metal wire I painted black to make it look like there's something inside the glass test tubes. I made a third test tube that's plain resin. To make a stand, I drilled 3 holes in a skinny stick. I'm staining it with brown paint mixed with rubbing alcohol. I cut 3 pieces of plastic canvas to make the rest of the stand and glued it in a U shape. I painted it black to look like metal and added the wooden piece to the top. For the final piece, I added one of my favorite miniatures, which is this small realistic pen, and I didn't want to commit to gluing it down, so I added it with wax. My favorite types of miniatures tend to be small, mundane things that make a scene look a lot more realistic. The top of the cabinet looks pretty empty, so I'm adding a stack of rags from a cut-up t-shirt. I'm aging the rags with some watered-down black paint, and I'm aging the cabinet with some Mod Podge mixed with brown paint. I allow the paint and Mod Podge mixture to dry and then wipe it away with a damp paper towel. The Mod Podge makes it resistant to being wiped away, so it ends up looking like dirt that's been building up over the years. I also used this paint and Mod Podge combo to age the glass and the white sink. It is so satisfying to me how gross this sink looks. I had some left over, so I added some underneath the cabinets as well to cast a shadow and add another layer of grime. Miniatures don't tend to cast their own realistic shadows, so it makes it look a lot better when you add them artificially yourself. It works like forced perspective and gives these cabinets and shelves some weight. To take up some space under the desk, I'm aging this old Resin stool. I'm adding the same paint and Mod Podge mixture to the stool and then wiping away some of the excess. I'm trying a paint crackle technique by adding some wet glue and adding wet paint right over top of it before the Elmer's glue dries. I'm laying the paint on heavy and trying to minimize my brush strokes to avoid disturbing the drying glue underneath. I used a heat gun to make it warped and distorted and cause some bubbles in the paint. It looks way too clean, so I'm adding some brown paint and I'll mostly wipe away the excess. I'm finishing the stool by lifting up some of the paint using a sewing pin so it looks like the paint is flaking off. I'm about ready to fill the sink with resin water, so I'm breaking up some plaster and gathering moss and other debris to add to the sink. I started by adding a small amount of UV resin to the sink and I'm adding the debris. This sink is right under the water-damaged ceiling, so I want it to look like water has filled the sink and pieces of the broken ceiling. I'm finishing with another layer of UV resin to seal it all in. Jumping back to the desk, I'm adding mold to the pages using watered-down paint on a toothbrush. Since the lab has a hole in the ceiling and water damage, I think it would make sense if the pages are moldy. To make it look like all of this stuff has actually been sitting here for a long time, I'm using a paintbrush to dab some white glue over the surface and shaving some white chalk pastels over the top of it. I'm using a clean dry brush to press the chalk pastels into the wet glue to make the desk look dusty. I came up with this method during my steampunk project and I really love how realistic it looks. Before the glue completely sets, you can use a damp Q-tip to remove the dust from any places you don't want it. I used the same method to add dust to the bottles as well as the chair rail. The simple detail of adding dust adds a lot of realism and looks great in photos. In a future video, I'll show how to make this water-damaged ceiling, but for now I want to make a hanging fluorescent light fixture to fill this empty space. I started by making holes through a piece of scrap mat board into the ceiling using a push pin. Using more mat board, I cut out 2 of these shapes for the ends. I'm using cardstock to cover the outside, so I glued down my mat board piece. It was too difficult to fold the cardstock over it, so I removed the end pieces and folded it and added them after the fact. Once the glue dried, I cut off the excess. Using the original holes as a guide, I made new holes through the cardstock. I'll be using these holes to add hanging chains from the ceiling, which is why I poked the holes through the paper into the ceiling to make sure all of the holes line up perfectly. Once the paint dried, I added a simple wash, which is just black acrylic paint and water. I use this often, so I make a bunch of it ahead of time and keep it in a squeeze bottle. It can take a while to dry, so I often speed up the process using my heat gun. I'm using Q-tips as the fluorescent light bulb, so I need to remove the cotton. I cut the Q-tips to the right size and now I'm covering them with packing tape so they'll look shiny like glass light bulbs. I believe over time this packing tape will turn yellow, so they'll eventually look cooler the older the project gets. Before I install the light bulbs, I'm adding the chain. I'm using a really small chain from an old piece of jewelry and I'm adding a small amount of wire through the bottom link. I folded the wire in half with some pliers and snipped it. I put the wire through the hole and used super glue on the back to hold it in place. I created the same thing on the other end and glued them to the ceiling. The chains are gold, so I'm covering them up with dirty down rust, and I also add some to the light fixture. Off camera, I added super glue to the chain to keep it from swinging and moving, so the chains are just stuck straight. I'm trying a new method of making the floors look old and dirty by cutting up some fiber fill to look like dust bunnies. I cut up the small fibers and used white glue to glue them around the corners of the room where dust bunnies would accumulate. I broke up some mini pine cones to look like leaves and glued them around the room. I also cut up some trash plastic to look like shards of broken glass from the cabinet door. I glued the glass around the desk, a little bit in the drawer, and a couple pieces on top. I'm really happy with how this project turned out, and I would love to hear your comments and feedback. Let me know what your favorite parts are and if there are any details you think I missed. My name is Shira, and I make videos like this every week, so please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you for watching.